Since we're all locked up in quarantine, I figured I'd make a video. Just be easier. My cat. So I hope y'all like it. Carl Ransom Rogers was born January 8th, 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois. He was born into a heavily religious household, with his father, Walter Rogers, being a Congregationalist, and his mother, Julia M. Cushing, being a devout Baptist. He was the fourth of 6 children. He developed high intelligence, learning to read at the age of 3, and great self-discipline working on his parents' farm. Rogers' career path was in agriculture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, during which time he traveled to China on an international Christian conference, where he became interested in the ministry. Rogers needed more than this. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin in 1924, he then enrolled in the Union Theological Seminary. After 2 years at the seminary, Rogers was not satisfied. His questions weren't met with enough answers. He was then ready to become a psychologist. He continued more education at Teachers College, Columbia University, obtaining his master's in 1928 and PhD in 1931, during which he began child study. After a brief internship, he was hired as a full-time psychologist in the child study department in Rochester, New York. Even though the salary was subpar for the time, the next 12 years of his life proved to be very insightful. He completed his first book, called The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, as said in the Carl Rogers Reader. This book gained him his first recognition in his industry. At this time, Rogers started to realize his true contribution and direction into psychology. Rogers went on to become a professor of clinical psychology at Ohio State University. He was invited to set up a counseling center at the University of Chicago. In 1947, he was elected president of the American Psychological Association. In 1956, he became the first president of the American Academy of Psychotherapists. In 1963, he left teaching at the University of Wisconsin and became a resident at the New Western Behavioral Sciences Institute in La Jolla, California, where he remained throughout the rest of his life, doing therapy, giving speeches, and writing, according to Wikipedia. Along with his daughter, Natalie Rogers, another psychologist, he contributed to workshops around the world based in cultural communications, personal growth, self-empowerment, and learning for social change. Rogers never stopped contributing, even until his death in 1987. His approach. Rogers' masterpiece was commonly known as the client-centered approach. In his humanistic psychology roots, he was wanting to change the landscape of counseling theory, and he was strongly influenced in constructing his approach by the post-Freudian psychotherapeutic practice of Otto Rank. As stated in an article in American Psychological Association, A Renaissance for Humanistic Psychology, Rebecca Clay says, emerging in the late 1950s, humanistic psychology began as a reaction against the 2 schools of thought then dominating American psychology. Behaviorism's insistence on applying the methods of physical science to human behavior caused adherents to neglect crucial subjective data, humanists believe. Similarly, psychoanalysis's emphasis on unconscious drives relegated the conscious mind to relative unimportance. 3 basic elements are needed to provide the psychological climate for Carl Rogers' approach: genuineness, acceptance, and empathetic understanding. We could see an example of how his conversational style functioned in his interview with Gloria in the film 3 Approaches to Psychotherapy. Commenting in an article by Cynthia Campbell and Scott Wickman is an analysis of that interview. How did Rogers' conversational devices function to enact empathy, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard? For example, as a part of his therapy opening statement, Rogers took a not knowing approach by using his phrases like, I don't know, I hope, I'm not sure, something, and whatever, all of which intentionally conveyed uncertainty and curiosity. Rogers' non-expert language made evident and owned genuineness. His inability to be an expert on Gloria, a woman he had known for less than 30 minutes, by acknowledging his inability to know Gloria's truth. Rogers also conveyed unconditional positive regard by respecting Gloria's ability to be an expert on herself. Another hallmark of Rogers' conversational style seemed to be that of making first-person quotes that externalized Gloria's hypothetical internal dialogue. For example, Rogers used a first-person quote from Gloria's perspective during a particularly frustrating moment for Gloria, stating, "I feel this is the conflict, and it's just insoluble, and therefore it's hopeless." By verbalizing what Gloria may have been thinking using her language as if he were her, and thereby again modeling I messages, Rogers' quotes displayed advanced empathy and explicitly stating a view of the situation through Gloria's eyes. Rogers also used invited repair. Usually people have the urge to correct themselves, but he turned this inside out by inviting himself to be corrected. Rogers' invitation for repair functioned to highlight genuineness in at least 3 ways. First, they demonstrated his interest and investment in a relationship by checking to make sure that message received was consistent with message sent. Second, they again called attention to his not being the expert on Gloria. Third, invitations for repair also facilitate transparency on his part, making his presentation out of self-consistent with what he was thinking internally. The act of inviting repair seemed to make agreement more likely. In everyday conversation, the natural responses to request for advice is to give advice. In contrast, Rogers demonstrated unconditional positive regard for Gloria by respecting her ability to come to her own decision. Rather than responding directly to her request for advice, he used non-expert language, negatively assessed the difficulty of the process, invited repair, and made empathy meta-statements that displayed his understanding of what she was experiencing. In short, he honored her expertise in arriving at her own meaningful outcome. Gloria not only felt heard, but also empowered, reinforcing her ability to change. The future in conclusion. Still to this day, some can criticize that the client-centered approach or humanistic approach can be touchy-feely or soft-hearted. Donald P. Moss, Ph.D., author of Humanistic and Transpersonal Psychology, a historical and biographical sourcebook, states, "When humanistic psychology came to the fore in 1950s, psychology was restricted to studying observable behavior for the most part. Today, we're no longer surprised when a psychological researcher wants to study cognitions, thinking, and feeling as a part of psychological research. Psychology has reclaimed the totality of human experience." In short, psychology would not be where it is today if it wasn't for the client-centered approach. When we all envision psychologists, we all see that man or woman nodding their head, scribbling, while they listen to their client on a leather chase lounge. I feel that this is inherently what Rogers contributed, an entire zeitgeist of functionality and method in the world of psychology today.